But the pineapple ban is really just part of a bigger, what's being called gray zone warfare being used against Taiwan. Can you give us an idea of what this kind of gray zone warfare is? Because it's not war as I think most Americans really understand it.
The gray zone has different meanings to depending who you ask, but it's trying to do things to affect your opponent, to bring your opponent down, bring him under your control. But these are things that don't quite reach the level of where the other side's going to say, we have to shoot back. It's just not quite enough. And it can be things like picking off Taiwan's allies in the South Pacific and creating this isolation. It can be the constant propaganda directed against Taiwan, the bullying, the threats that if you don't give up, surrender, we just might come and kill you. That sort of thing. It's not nice, but it's not enough to counterattack or to fight, to shoot back. You have, and I mentioned earlier, the Chinese aircraft, which come close to Taiwan every single day. They go over the informally agreed upon lines that people don't cross. Chinese naval ships as well going around the island, Chinese submarines showing up in places, the Chinese doing exercises, amphibious landings throughout the area around Taiwan. And these are all things that are ramping up the pressure, the psychological, physical pressure wearing down Taiwan's military. But if you look at it from Taiwan's perspective or from America's perspective, how do you resist that? How do you fight back? And that's what is most troubling with gray zone activities is that it tends to handcuff the opponent. If the opponent is someone who sort of believes in rules, international law, and just civilized behavior, you don't quite know how to respond to it. And the Chinese have done this very well against the Japanese next door, which is an interesting dynamic because one classic approach is to send 300 or 400 fishing boats into Japanese water around Japanese islands to dare the Japanese to do something about it. Japan is not going to go to war over fishing boats, but they do find that they can't handle it. And it's psychologically demoralizing. Plus, the Chinese are showing them, anytime we want, we can do this again. And so that's is a pretty good example of the gray zone in its immediate area, overseas, and in the capitals, in the countries that supposedly support Taiwan, they face this kind of pressure as well. So it's a challenge. And at some point, I think we're going to wake up and tell the Chinese, enough's enough. And we are going to shoot back if you overreach. At some point, it has to come to that. Or we're going to cut you off from the US dollar system. That would work pretty well, too.
Yeah, it seems like perhaps economic action would be more effective. That's actually something kind of the Trump administration did. Because, like the Japanese, they don't want to just execute a bunch of civilian Chinese fishermen. But using economic leverage against the Chinese Communist Party, that could be actually pretty effective.
Yeah, that's right. And I've said for a while that the solution to the South China Sea probably won't be found in the South China Sea. And the point being that, as I think you correctly stated, is that trying to match these gray zone activities one for one, or you're going to find yourself running all over the place. You're probably going to find yourself outmatched. So you find some other area where your opponent is particularly vulnerable. And in this case, it is that absolute dependence on foreign exchange, on convertible currency. It's the thing that keeps the Chinese Communist Party running, keeps that Chinese economy going, is that foreign exchange which they have access to. And they get it by selling things overseas, by foreign companies investing into China. And that allows China to have money that they can actually use to pay for things overseas because nobody much wants Chinese currency. So it sort of makes sense if you control that to limit the amount of foreign currency China has access to. It's going to cause huge problems with their economy, with their financial system, and ultimately with China's Communist Party control. And that is something the Trump administration did recognize. And it's not all that complicated. But you'll see that applying pressure there, it potentially can cause the other side to back off against Taiwan in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea as well. It can potentially restrain behavior, but you've got to do it in a way that you have to apply the pressure somewhere where the other guy is really going to feel it, and not, as you've noted, we talked about, not try to match them one for one. If they send 300 fishing boats, we'll send 301. Or we'll build our Coast Guard into 500,000 people with 1,000 ships. No, just, as I said, cut off their access to foreign currency, and that will have a real effect on them.
So from that perspective, do you think that perhaps the freedom of navigation operations the U.S. has been doing maybe aren't the most effective thing that could be done?
If that's all we're doing, it's not. It really has to be backed up by a clear demonstration that we are going to apply pressure everywhere, and particularly where it hurts the most. And once again, that goes to the financial underpinnings of the Chinese Communist Party. Because I tend to look at the freedom of navigation exercises, which they have their usefulness if they are part of a larger, coherent strategy. But otherwise, it's like the old days when in New York City, you remember that before Rudy Giuliani cleaned up Times Square, the NYPD, they could drive a patrol car through Times Square anytime they wanted. And all those criminals running the three-card Monte games and trying to, steal from you, they would all part and they would go get out of the way and the patrol car would go through. And then as soon as it had gone through, the criminals came back, they took over Times Square, and everyone knew who was the boss. And that's what some of our efforts in the South China Sea remind me of, is the U.S. 7th Fleet sending a carrier down through parting the waves, parting the waters. The Chinese are hovering around the edges, but they don't stop it and they let it go. And we get a lot of good photo opportunities, and then it's gone, and then it closes back up. And all the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard, they're back on station, and it's as if the Americans were never there. So as I said, it has to be more than just that, and it's a part of a larger effort to effectively apply pressure. But this isn't going to intimidate the Chinese for very long, and I see it.